the fall of the Byzantine Empire. It's a phrase that has echoed through the corridors of history since May 29th, 1453, the day Constantinople fell to the armies of Sultan maimed Roman II. For many, that date marks the end of the once mighty Eastern Roman Empire, an empire that traced its lineage back to Caesar and Augustus, to Constantine the Great, and to the golden domes of a Christian Rome born in the East. But the true story, the full story, of the fall of Byzantium does not end at the breach of the Theodosian walls. No, the fall continues well beyond the final charge of the Janissaries. This is the story of what came after, the death of a body, but the lingering soul. To understand how Byzantium's fall reached beyond 1453, we must first revisit the empire's last days, not as a dramatic finale, but as a beginning of something else. In its final centuries, Byzantium had already been bleeding away, its territories carved apart, its emperors clinging to the walls of Constantinople, a flickering candle in the vast darkness of Ottoman expansion. By 1453, the Byzantine Empire had shrunk to little more than the city itself, and a few outlying territories, like the Despotate of the Mora and the Empire of Trebizond, both technically Byzantine in culture and lineage. When the city fell, Emperor Constantine Roman XI Palaiologos died with his sword drawn, vanishing into the streets rather than surrender. His death was both literal and symbolic. Yet even in death, something of Byzantium survived, in memory, in exile, in resistance, and in legacy. Let's begin with the immediate aftermath. After maimed Roman II's triumphal entry into the Hagia Sophia, the transformation of the city began. Constantinople became Istanbul. Hagia Sophia became a mosque. The population was forcibly reorganized. Greek nobles were killed, enslaved, or exiled. Yet Maimed was no mere destroyer. He was a tactician, a political visionary, and he knew that ruling a city like Constantinople meant understanding and utilizing its Roman heritage. So he declared himself not just Sultan of the Ottomans, but also Caesar of the Romans. In doing so, he attempted to appropriate the legacy of Byzantium. He invited Orthodox clergy to return. He re-established the Orthodox Patriarchate within Istanbul. The ecumenical patriarch, Gennadios Scholarios, was installed not by the church, but by the Sultan himself. A symbol of Maimed's control, but also of his desire to maintain the illusion of continuity. Byzantium, then, didn't simply vanish. It was absorbed, rebranded, and filtered through the Ottoman machine. But the story doesn't stay within the walls of Istanbul. Because the fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves across the Orthodox world, and far beyond. In the Despotate of the Mora, the last semi-autonomous Greek stronghold in the Peloponnese, Constantine's brothers Thomas and Demetrios held on briefly, squabbling among themselves while the Ottomans loomed ever closer. By 1460, the Mora too was absorbed, and the Palaiologos brothers were cast into very different roles. Demetrios submitted to the Sultan and lived out his days in obscurity. Thomas, however, fled to Italy, carrying with him relics, manuscripts, and the faint ember of a lost empire. In Rome, he was received as a prince of Byzantium, a relic of Eastern Christianity and a useful symbol in the Catholic world's long war of ideology against Islam. He was granted a pension by the papacy and lived as a Byzantine emperor in exile, though the empire itself was gone. And he was not the only one. Throughout the Mediterranean, exiled Byzantine nobles took refuge in Italian city-states, in the courts of France, and even as far afield as Muscovy. They brought with them language, culture, theology, and bitterness. They also brought the flame of restoration. Among these exiles, a dream emerged, an idea that Byzantium could rise again, that the empire, though slain, could return like a phoenix. And so the myth of the Byzantine restoration took root, not in the east, but in the west. In Venice, Genoa, and Florence, the influx of Byzantine scholars helped kindle the Renaissance. Men like Bessarion and Gemistus Pletho infused Western Europe with Greek philosophy, Platonic thought, and classical knowledge preserved for centuries in Orthodox monasteries. The Byzantine legacy now flowed not just into Islam via the Ottomans, but into Latin Christendom through the scholarly diaspora. It is no exaggeration to say that without the fall of Constantinople, the Italian Renaissance might have looked very different. And then, far to the north, something even more curious began to stir. In the growing state of Muscovy, what would become Russia, the fall of Byzantium was seen not as the end of Rome, but as a transition. The Eastern Orthodox Church had long looked to Constantinople as its spiritual center. With that center now under Islamic rule, Muscovite princes and clergy began to see themselves as the new defenders of orthodoxy. And so emerged the idea of Moscow as the third Rome. The first Rome had fallen to heresy and barbarism. The second, Constantinople, had been taken by the infidel. But Moscow would stand firm. Ivan Roman III married Sophia Palaeologina, niece of the last Byzantine emperor, and with that union claimed a dynastic link to the imperial past. The Byzantine eagle, two-headed, became the symbol of Russia. The Byzantine court ritual, its pomp, its language of empire, were reborn in the Kremlin. Thus, long after the fall of Byzantium, its legacy became the foundation for a new empire. The Tsars styled themselves as successors of Rome, not Latin Rome, but Eastern Rome, Orthodox Rome. The Roman idea, centuries after its apparent death, was taking on new Slavic flesh. Meanwhile, in the East, the remnants of Byzantine rule continued to flicker briefly. The Empire of Trebizond, perched on the southern coast of the Black Sea, had long been a Byzantine offshoot, ruled by a cadet branch of the Komnenos dynasty. After 1453, Trebizond remained independent for 8 more years, a stubborn holdout in a sea of Ottoman control. But in 1461, maimed Roman II turned his attention there. After a brief campaign, Trebizond fell. Its last emperor, David Komnenos, was brought to Constantinople. At first, he was treated with courtesy, allowed to live in relative comfort, but suspicion followed him. In 1463, accused of treason, he and his sons were executed. The Komnenoi were no more. With that, the last fragment of Byzantine sovereignty was extinguished. But the soul of Byzantium had long since taken root elsewhere. In monasteries on Mount Athos, Byzantine traditions continued. The chants, the liturgies, the calligraphy, the icons, all preserved with monkish discipline, largely untouched by Ottoman interference. Athos became a kind of time capsule, a living museum of pre-conquest Byzantium. It remained a beacon for Orthodox pilgrims and a center of learning. In Crete and the Ionian Islands, under Venetian rule, Byzantine culture fused with Latin influences to create new hybrids, Orthodox theology in Italian tongues, Byzantine icons with Renaissance techniques. The legacy was mutating, adapting. Even in the Ottoman capital, the Orthodox Patriarchate continued to function, albeit under close surveillance. The Sultan knew that ruling a diverse empire required a delicate balance. He allowed the Patriarch to oversee Christian affairs, making the church part of the state bureaucracy. The Orthodox Church thus survived, but it also became an instrument of imperial control. And then there were the myths. Over the centuries, legends grew around the last emperor. Constantine Roman XI was said by some not to have died, but to have been rescued by angels, turned to marble, and hidden beneath the Golden Gate of Constantinople. One day, the stories claimed, he would rise again, reclaim the city, and restore the empire. It was an orthodox version of King Arthur or the Mahdi, a messianic hope in the face of domination. These legends fueled resistance. During the Greek War of Independence in the 19th century, rebels invoked the name of Constantinople. The image of the double-headed eagle re-emerged. Songs were sung of Byzantium's return. In some ways, the empire never truly died. It lived on in dream and defiance, but perhaps the most subtle form of survival was cultural. The Byzantine sense of authority, of divine kingship, of orthodoxy as empire, All these ideas infiltrated the lands once ruled by it. The Balkans, the Caucasus, the Levant, regions shaped by centuries of Byzantine administration, language, and law, carried that legacy forward even as they passed from one empire to another. The Ottomans themselves adopted many Byzantine practices, from tax systems to court hierarchy. Istanbul was not just a Turkish city, it was a Byzantine one under new management. Even the calendar bore marks of Rome. The Orthodox world retained the Julian calendar. The Church still celebrated Easter using the ancient computus. The empire's religious rhythms endured. And so we come to understand that 1453 was not the end, but a transformation. The fall of the Byzantine Empire was not a single moment, but a prolonged metamorphosis. Its body was broken, but its spirit wandered into the west, into the north, into the dreams of the faithful. It became a foundation stone for Russia, a spark for the Renaissance, a ghost haunting Greek nationalism. In the next chapter of this documentary, we will trace how this legacy evolved through the centuries, shaping the world in unexpected ways. From the battlefields of Eastern Europe to the debates of theologians, from revolutions to revivals, from myth to modernity. Byzantium, it seems, never truly died. The centuries after 1453 would see the Byzantine identity dissolve, harden, mutate, and reappear in strange forms, like a phantom slipping between the cracks of history. The memory of the empire, distorted or sanctified depending on who invoked it, became both a rallying cry and a haunting reminder of a lost world. Let us now enter the 16th and 17th centuries, the age of empires built on the ashes of older ones. The Ottomans, inheriting the imperial throne in their own eyes, expanded relentlessly. They took over the Balkans, Syria, Egypt, and much of North Africa. Their navy ruled the eastern Mediterranean, and their armies pressed into the heart of Europe. But what is often overlooked is how Byzantine administrative models quietly undergirded their governance. The Ottomans ruled a patchwork empire, and they needed an adaptable framework for managing diverse religions and ethnicities. From this need emerged the millet system, in which each religious group was semi-autonomous under its own leader, yet ultimately accountable to the Sultan. For Orthodox Christians, this meant that the Patriarch of Constantinople, now residing in the Fana district, functioned almost like a civic leader. He collected taxes, settled disputes, and maintained discipline within the community. This was a poisoned chalice. While it preserved the structure of the Orthodox Church and a faint whisper of imperial Orthodox identity, it also turned the Church into an administrative branch of the Islamic State. The Patriarchate, once the spiritual heart of Eastern Christianity, now navigated between survival and submission. But within that survival, cultural continuity endured. The liturgy remained largely unchanged. Greek remained the language of worship. Icons still glowed in candlelit chapels. The theological works of the Church Fathers were copied and studied, keeping the intellectual flame of Byzantium flickering. And as generations passed, what had once been imperial confidence slowly hardened into religious resistance. Meanwhile, in Muscovy, the seeds planted by Sophia Paleologina began to bear fruit. Ivan Roman IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, became the first Russian ruler to formally adopt the title of Tsar, a derivative of Caesar. His coronation in 1547 marked the assertion that Moscow had inherited the mantle of Rome. It wasn't just rhetoric. Russian court ceremony mimicked Byzantine forms. Russian Orthodox theology drew on Greek sources, and Moscow built its own Hagia Sophia in Novgorod and its own imperial city in the Kremlin. The Russian Orthodox Church declared itself autocephalous, independent of the now subjugated Patriarchate of Constantinople, and eventually a new patriarch was installed in Moscow. The torch had passed, at least in their eyes, but this transfer was not universally accepted. The Greeks, especially those who remained under Ottoman rule, continued to see themselves as the rightful bearers of the Orthodox tradition. even in their degraded political state. And thus began an awkward rivalry between Greek orthodoxy, burdened and constrained, and Russian orthodoxy, rising and assertive. But despite the tensions, the two worlds remained connected. Greek theologians fled Ottoman repression and found sanctuary in Russia. Russian pilgrims visited Mount Athos. Monasteries in the Holy Land were supported by donations from Muscovite princes. There remained a sense of shared identity, even if divided by circumstance. Back in the Ottoman world, the 17th century saw both consolidation and decay. The empire was vast, but internal corruption, revolts, and external pressures began to strain the Ottoman machine. During this period, Greek merchants and intellectuals began to flourish in the cracks. The so-called Phanariotes, Greek aristocrats based in the Fana district of Istanbul, rose to prominence. Educated, multilingual, and shrewd, they often served as diplomats, interpreters, and administrators for the Ottomans. Some even became princes of the Danubian principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia. These Phanariotes were Byzantine in language and culture, yet Ottoman in allegiance. They walked a delicate tightrope, loyal to their masters but nostalgic for their imperial heritage. In their salons, Byzantine history was studied. Manuscripts were collected, maps were drawn, and always, just beneath the surface, simmered the memory of Constantinople as capital of the Romans. The 18th century brought new shifts. As the Enlightenment swept through Europe, ideas of nationalism, secularism, and historical destiny began to take root even in the Orthodox East. Greek intellectuals, many educated in Western Europe, began to reinterpret their Byzantine past not merely as religious heritage, but as national identity. Figures like Adamantios Korais began to advocate for a purified Greek language, free of Turkish influence. He saw Byzantium as a dark age, but one that still carried the inheritance of Hellenism. Others, however, embraced the Byzantine legacy as central to Greek identity. The tension between these camps, Hellenists and Romioi, would shape the future of Greek nationalism. Romioi, that was what many Greeks called themselves, even centuries after the empire's fall. Not Hellenes, not Greeks, but Romans. For them, Byzantium had not been a medieval curiosity, it had been the Eastern Roman Empire. And they, its people, were Romans in exile. That self-conception would persist deep into the 19th century. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had become known as the sick man of Europe. Its grip on the Balkans was weakening. Local revolts simmered. Western powers eyed its territories, and among the Greeks, the dream of freedom began to take shape. In 1821, the Greek War of Independence began, and with it, the ghosts of Byzantium marched again. The rebels raised the banner with the double-headed eagle. They invoked the name of Constantine. Songs were sung about the resurrection of the empire. The church, long a tool of Ottoman control, now became a pillar of resistance. Monasteries provided fighters, shelter, and spiritual justification. Priests blessed rifles and banners. But the war was not just about romanticism. It was brutal, bloody, and complex. Greeks massacred Muslims. The Ottomans retaliated with ferocity. Entire towns were destroyed, and yet the rebellion endured, with support from Western Europe, especially Philhellenic movements in Britain and France. The Greeks gained independence in 1830, yet they did not establish a new Byzantium. Instead, the new Greek state was a kingdom imported from Europe, ruled by a Bavarian prince named Otto. Still, the capital was eventually moved to Athens, and the language of ancient Greece was revived. It was not a Byzantine restoration, but a Hellenic rebirth. And yet Byzantium would not be forgotten. Throughout the 19th century, Greek nationalists looked toward the still Ottoman city of Constantinople. They dreamed of reclaiming it, of restoring it. This vision became known as the Megali idea, the great idea. It was a concept that Greece should expand to include all lands historically or ethnically Greek, including Constantinople itself. It was a dream drenched in history, soaked in blood, and fueled by the memory of empire. The megali idea would dominate Greek politics for a century. It led Greece into wars, alliances, betrayals, and ultimately to disaster. After World War I, with the Ottoman Empire in collapse, the Greek army marched into Anatolia, hoping to seize Smyrna and perhaps even Constantinople. For a brief moment, the dream seemed within reach. But the Turkish War of Independence, led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, crushed the Greek campaign. Smyrna burned. A population exchange was imposed. Over 1 million Greeks were expelled from Turkey and 500,000 Muslims from Greece. The ancient Greek communities of Asia Minor, including those who had survived since Byzantine times, were extinguished. The Byzantine dream had driven the Greek state into catastrophe. By the 20th century, Byzantium's legacy had fractured. In the East, it had been erased or forcibly assimilated. In the West, it had become a topic for academics and artists. And in Russia, it had mutated again, first into the autocracy of the Romanovs, then into something altogether different. The Russian Empire, like Byzantium before it, claimed to be orthodox, universal, and divinely sanctioned. But with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, that imperial orthodox vision was shattered. Churches were desecrated, priests executed. The Byzantine legacy was driven underground. Icons were hidden. Chant became silence. And yet even in Soviet Russia, Byzantium was never truly forgotten. Some saw it as a symbol of religious oppression. Others studied it for its artistic and architectural innovations. And in exile, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia kept the Byzantine traditions alive. In Paris, in New York, in Jerusalem, liturgies continued in the ancient style. As the 20th century progressed, Byzantium re-entered the popular consciousness, not as an empire, but as an idea. Scholars like Stephen Runciman and John Julius Norwich wrote sweeping histories that captivated Western audiences. The Hagia Sophia became a monument visited by millions. Byzantine art was displayed in museums. Its music was studied. Its complexity appreciated. In Greece, the Orthodox Church regained prestige. In the wake of World War II and the Greek Civil War, religious identity became a unifying force. And Byzantium, once seen by secularists as medieval and backward, was slowly reabsorbed into the national story. Today, the fall of Byzantium is commemorated annually on May 29th. It is marked by liturgies, by cultural events, and by solemn remembrance. In Istanbul, Hagia Sophia is once again a mosque, following a controversial decision in 2020 to reverse its status as a museum. The decision was met with celebration in Turkey and mourning in parts of the Orthodox world. The ghosts of empire still whisper in its domes, and that is the deeper truth. Byzantium never fell in a final sense. It was murdered, resurrected, mythologized, and repurposed. Its borders vanished, but its influence spread. Its emperors died, but its saints endured. Its political structures crumbled, but its art, its theology, and its dreams survived. The fall of the Byzantine Empire was not a single event, but a continuum. A 1,000-year death that gave birth to countless new forms. A Roman Empire that passed into Christianity, into Orthodoxy, into Russia, into modern Greece, into the world. It is not merely a story of decline. It is a story of transformation. As we move deeper into the currents of history, the echoes of Byzantium ripple outward into the modern era, not just in politics or religion, but in law, identity, memory, and even conflict. The fall of the empire did not merely scatter its people, it fractured its soul, embedding shards of it across the Orthodox world and beyond. Let's return to Russia, now under Soviet control. The Byzantine legacy had helped shape the very concept of the Russian Tsardom. Moscow had adopted not only the religious symbolism of Byzantium, but its autocratic ideology. The idea that the ruler was divinely sanctioned, that the church and state must be in harmony, and that the empire existed to uphold eternal truths. But all of that was obliterated by Lenin's revolution. The Soviets declared war not just on the old aristocracy, but on the Byzantine inheritance itself. Churches were closed or demolished. Monasteries were seized and turned into labor camps. The liturgical calendar was replaced by a secular workweek. Byzantine art was declared reactionary. Icons were smashed or hidden. The Romanov dynasty, once cloaked in Byzantine imagery, was executed without ceremony. But history has a strange way of persisting. Even under the weight of persecution, the Russian Orthodox Church survived. Some bishops and priests went underground. Others escaped abroad. A vast ecclesiastical diaspora took root, especially in the United States, Western Europe, and the Middle East. These immigrant communities, often composed of former nobility and intellectuals, clung fiercely to Byzantine liturgy and aesthetics. Icons painted in the traditional style, choirs chanting in Church Slavonic, altar rites preserved with ritualistic precision. In exile, Byzantium became sacred memory. Meanwhile, back in the Balkans, the 20th century was reshaping nations with fire. The fall of the Ottoman Empire after World War I left a power vacuum across southeastern Europe. In its place arose fragile nation-states, each trying to define itself. For the Greeks, this meant revisiting the symbols of Byzantium. The double-headed eagle became part of the Greek Orthodox Church's iconography once more. Byzantine names, architecture, and references returned in the rhetoric of statecraft. But it was not only Greece. Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania had all once been under Byzantine spiritual dominion. Their churches had been granted autonomy by Constantinople. Their monarchs had been crowned with Byzantine blessing. Even after centuries of Ottoman rule, these memories lingered. In national epics, the glory of ancient orthodoxy was praised. Medieval Serbian kings were presented as heirs to Constantinople. Romanian princes traced their legitimacy to the Eastern Christian order. And yet, these same regions would fall into darkness once again during the Cold War. Communist regimes, following the Soviet model, targeted the church as an enemy of the people. Priests were imprisoned. Monasteries were ransacked. Religious instruction was banned. And with that, another layer of the Byzantine heritage was buried under ideology. Yet even then, in whispers, in hidden rites, in family traditions, the Byzantine faith endured. Then came 1989. The Iron Curtain fell. One by one, communist regimes collapsed, and from the rubble, the church re-emerged. In Russia, the Orthodox Church regained a public voice. The Kremlin forged a new alliance with patriarchs. Cathedral bells, silent for decades, rang again. In Serbia, orthodoxy surged, intertwining itself with nationalist rhetoric during the Yugoslav wars. The 1990s saw a revival of Byzantine aesthetics, mosaics, domes, and chant in newly rebuilt or restored churches. In Greece, too, the Byzantine past was reclaimed. Schools taught Byzantine history as national heritage. The division between ancient Hellenism and Christian Byzantium began to blur. The empire was no longer seen as a fall from classical grace, but as a continuation, a Christian Greek civilization that had preserved Hellenic values in religious form. But Byzantium's presence in the modern world isn't only cultural, it is geopolitical. Consider the title of ecumenical patriarch. The Patriarch of Constantinople, once the spiritual head of the Orthodox world, now resides in Istanbul as a figure of extraordinary symbolism but limited power. The modern Turkish state, secular yet nationalist, regards the Patriarch with suspicion. He is not permitted to use the title ecumenical in an official capacity within Turkey. The Patriarchate's properties are restricted. The theological school at Halki, once a vital seminary for training Orthodox clergy, remains closed, and yet the Patriarchate persists. A living fossil of a lost empire, nestled within the crowded alleys of a city that has changed its name, but not its layers. The rivalry between Constantinople and Moscow, too, continues. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russian Orthodox Church has reasserted itself as the leader of global orthodoxy. It has criticized the ecumenical patriarchate's role and claimed greater authority, especially in the Slavic world. When Constantinople granted autocephaly to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in 2019, breaking it from Moscow's jurisdiction, the Russian Church severed ties with the Patriarchate. The schism was not merely about ecclesiastical governance, it was about imperial legacy. Russia saw itself as the Third Rome. Constantinople had no right, in their view, to divide the Orthodox world, and so the ancient contest reignited. The legacy of Byzantium, 15 centuries old, was once again shaping modern politics. Meanwhile, in academic and artistic circles, Byzantium has undergone a renaissance of a different kind. Once dismissed as decadent and mystical, especially by Enlightenment thinkers who favored the rational clarity of ancient Greece, Byzantium is now appreciated for its complexity. Its art, once thought stiff and formal, is seen as profoundly symbolic. Its theology, once criticized as pedantic, is respected for its depth and nuance. Museums across the world feature Byzantine exhibits, icons, reliquaries, manuscripts, and vestments. Universities teach Byzantine history as a distinct and rich field. Even video games and films, though still rare in their historical accuracy, draw on Byzantine aesthetics and imagery. And then there is the digital resurrection. Modern technology has allowed for the reconstruction of Byzantine architecture in virtual reality. The Hagia Sophia, now once again a mosque, can be toured online in its Christian glory. Chant, once confined to liturgies, is now available on streaming platforms. Scholars use digital tools to decipher ancient manuscripts and palimpsests. Byzantium lives again, not as an empire of marble and fire, but as a ghost in the machine. In modern Greece, the Byzantine identity is part of the national DNA. Names like Basil, Constantine, and Irene are commonplace. Feast days celebrate saints and emperors of the old empire. Churches are designed with domes and gold leaf icons. Children learn about the fall of Constantinople in school, not as a distant tragedy, but as a wound that never fully healed. And among the diaspora, Greeks in Australia, Canada, the US, and Britain, the Byzantine Church serves as a cultural anchor. Greek Orthodox cathedrals, richly adorned, carry the empire's legacy into the hearts of distant lands. Weddings, baptisms, funerals, all echo with ancient prayers first whispered under the dome of Hagia Sophia. But it is not only among Greeks that the Byzantine memory survives. In Serbia, Byzantium is revered for its role in shaping medieval Serbian kingship and church hierarchy. In Romania, the Orthodox Church maintains many Byzantine customs. In Armenia and Georgia, though theologically distinct, the shared experience of Christian survival under empire ties them to Byzantium's fate. Even in Turkey, the legacy of Byzantium is becoming harder to ignore. While the state emphasizes its Ottoman and Islamic heritage, younger generations, historians and tourists are discovering the Byzantine past with renewed interest. Restoration projects, though often controversial, have revealed mosaics hidden under plaster. Tours of ancient churches attract both foreign and local visitors. The tension remains, but the curiosity grows. And so we find ourselves in a world still shaped by Byzantium, even if few recognize it. The Eastern Roman Empire may have lost its armies, its crown, its capital, but it planted seeds in every realm it touched, in the hearts of believers, in the minds of scholars, in the symbols of states, in the stones of churches, in the songs of choirs. Byzantium was never merely a continuation of Rome, nor was it a failed medieval kingdom. It was a bridge between worlds, between pagan and Christian, between Latin and Greek, between Europe and Asia, between empire and church, between past and future. Its fall did not come with a single stroke. It was a dismemberment across centuries, 1,000 cuts, a transformation, a migration of spirit, and even now it is not finished. Because as long as men and women chant the ancient liturgy, as long as domes rise above city streets, As long as icons are kissed and histories are written, Byzantium breathes. Its empire may be dust, but its soul endures. To grasp the full magnitude of Byzantium's enduring shadow, we must dig beneath the surface of nations, institutions, and symbols. The fall was not simply a transfer of power from emperors to sultans. It was a seismic cultural, religious, and ideological rupture, one whose aftershocks continue to ripple through the very questions we ask about identity, faith, sovereignty, and memory. This legacy is not preserved merely in museums or liturgies. It lives in the subtleties of law, the tensions of diplomacy, and the aspirations of peoples still reckoning with what was lost, and what might one day be restored. Let us now turn to the Orthodox Church, the living institution most intimately tied to the Byzantine state. If the emperor was the earthly image of divine order, the Church was its voice. Even after the fall of Constantinople, orthodoxy remained Byzantine at its core. Its liturgical language, rituals, and ecclesiology were rooted in the empire. Its bishops still wore vestments designed in the courtly style of the 10th century. Its churches still followed the imperial calendar. Every great Lent, every Holy Week, every Pascha echoed with hymns composed by Byzantine monks centuries before. This is not incidental. While Rome's empire died in fire, Byzantium's passed into ritual. The Church became the archive of an empire that no longer existed, preserving its customs, art, and intellectual tradition not as history, but as living practice. In Orthodox theology, this continuity is more than symbolic. The Church sees itself not as an institution formed in 33 AD and later broken into pieces, but as a continuous living body, the same one that once crowned emperors in Hagia Sophia. And thus, the memory of Byzantium is not a monument to the past, but a reflection of the present. In every divine liturgy celebrated in an Orthodox church, from a wooden chapel in Siberia to a cathedral in Chicago, Byzantium breathes through incense, chant, vestment, and gesture. But this continuity is not without conflict. Within the Orthodox world, the legacy of the empire remains contested. The Patriarch of Constantinople still bears the title Ecumenical Patriarch, a title that once meant supreme honor among the Orthodox churches, rooted in his role as bishop of the imperial capital. Yet, as we've seen, his actual power has eroded, particularly with the rise of the Russian Orthodox Church. Moscow now commands the largest and wealthiest Orthodox flock on earth, and it regards itself as the true protector of orthodoxy. This rivalry has deep roots. When Moscow claimed the role of the Third Rome, it did so with theological and dynastic justification. Ivan Roman III married the niece of the last emperor. His successors adopted the title of Tsar. Russian monasteries received exiled Byzantine clergy. Icons were painted in the Byzantine style. Even the architecture of churches in Novgorod and Moscow bore the influence of Constantinople. But Constantinople never recognized Moscow's supremacy. Even after granting it autocephaly in 1589, the Ecumenical Patriarchate retained the right to judge disputes among Orthodox churches, a role that Russia increasingly rejected. When the Patriarchate recognized an independent Ukrainian church in the 21st century, Moscow severed communion, viewing it as an imperial overreach. The conflict, centuries in the making, is not merely about jurisdiction. It is about inheritance. It is about who speaks for Byzantium now. Meanwhile, other Orthodox communities, particularly in the Balkans and the Levant, have found themselves caught in the middle. The churches of Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Antioch all emerged during the Byzantine centuries, often under its tutelage. Today, they are autonomous, yet they remain deeply influenced by Byzantine tradition. In Serbia, for instance, the medieval Nemanjic dynasty was crowned with the approval of Constantinople. Monasteries like Studenica and Hilandar were built with Byzantine architectural models. The Serbian Orthodox Church still celebrates saints who once ruled as kings and tsars in a world shaped by Byzantine diplomacy. Romania, divided historically between Latin and Slavic spheres, nonetheless has a church that uses a Byzantine rite. Its monasteries in Bukovina and Moldavia are covered with frescoes in the Byzantine style. Its liturgical music echoes Athonite chants. In the Levant, the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Antioch continues to pray in Arabic, but its ecclesiology is Byzantine. The churches of Jerusalem and Alexandria follow the same patterns. And in the Holy Land, Christian pilgrims from across the Orthodox world trace the footsteps of Christ using liturgical texts crafted by Byzantine theologians. Thus, the fall of the empire did not fragment orthodoxy. It scattered it into lands and languages far beyond the Bosphorus, but still bearing the mark of Constantinople. But Byzantium's influence was not limited to religion. It permeated law, governance, and urban life. In the realm of law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, served as the foundation for civil law traditions across Europe. Even long after the fall of Constantinople, this legal corpus was studied and implemented in Western universities. Its influence can still be found in modern legal codes in continental Europe and Latin America. The Roman roots of law persisted, but the medieval Byzantine interpretation shaped how law was taught, recorded, and enforced. In governance, the Byzantine ideal of symphonia, harmony between church and state, was never forgotten. Though criticized by modern secularists, this ideal persisted in the political theology of Eastern Europe, especially in the Tsardom of Russia, and later in the rhetoric of some modern Orthodox thinkers. It proposed not a theocracy, but a balance. The emperor ruled the body, the patriarch the soul, each guiding the other. Even city planning carried Byzantine DNA. In Eastern European capitals, churches often occupy central urban spaces, just as they did in Byzantine cities. The use of domes, mosaics, and cross-and-square architecture has reappeared in modern Orthodox cathedrals, from Belgrade to Bucharest, from Sofia to Addis Ababa. These structures are not mere imitations. They are statements. They say, we remember who we are. And yet, in remembering Byzantium, modern nations have also reshaped it. Greek nationalism, as mentioned, once viewed Byzantium with skepticism, seeing it as a medieval fog obscuring the light of classical Greece. But by the 20th century, that view shifted. Byzantium was embraced as the true bridge between antiquity and modernity. In Greek historical education, Byzantine emperors are treated not as foreign rulers, but as Greek monarchs. The empire is called the Greek Empire of Byzantium, despite the fact that its people called themselves Romans, not Hellenes. This tension between the Roman name and Greek identity remains a subject of historical debate. Were the Byzantines Roman or Greek? The answer is both, and neither. They were Romaoi, Romans in name, Greek in language, Orthodox in faith. Their empire preserved classical heritage, transformed by Christian theology, expressed through Eastern aesthetics. They translated Plato into political theology. They turned Caesar into Basilius. They fused Jerusalem and Athens into one sacred vision. In modern Turkey, however, the Byzantine past is still politically charged. While Istanbul houses some of the greatest Byzantine monuments on earth, they are often treated with ambivalence. Hagia Sophia, perhaps the most famous, was long a museum, an emblem of secularism under Ataturk's republic. But in 2020, it was reconverted into a mosque. The decision sparked international debate, not only because of its religious implications, but because of what it symbolized: a deliberate rejection of the shared Byzantine-Ottoman heritage in favor of a purely Islamic nationalist narrative. Other Byzantine churches in Istanbul remain shuttered, neglected, or partially restored. Some are protected as UNESCO sites, others face slow decay. Yet despite these obstacles, interest in Byzantium among Turkish scholars has grown. Younger historians are re-examining the Byzantine era not as a foreign occupation, but as part of Anatolia's layered past. Tourism, too, has played a role in softening public perception. International visitors flock to Istanbul not only for its Ottoman mosques, but also for its Byzantine churches, mosaics, and relics. Guides speak of Constantine and Theodora alongside Suleiman and Mehmed. The layers are impossible to ignore. And this is where the true legacy of Byzantium resides, not in a throne or in the titles of long-dead emperors, but in layers, layers of identity, layers of memory, layers of continuity and rupture. Byzantium exists today in the shared consciousness of those who remember. In the scholar reading medieval Greek, in the priest lifting the chalice, in the pilgrim kissing the icon, in the tourist gazing at golden domes, in the chant rising through candlelit naves. It exists in the very questions we ask about East and West, about faith and reason, about state and church, about continuity and change. For over 1,000 years, Byzantium stood between worlds, and in its fall, it passed that burden on to us. As the centuries rolled on and empires rose and fell, the spirit of Byzantium refused to be laid to rest. Even in its shattered, scattered form, it proved more enduring than many of the powers that replaced it. The fall in 1453 may have closed the gates of Constantinople, but the soul of the empire had already begun to wander, transforming not just into ecclesiastical tradition or nationalist memory, but into a complex cultural inheritance that continued to reshape itself, finding new expressions and contradictions in the modern age. We have seen how the Byzantine identity survived in Orthodox liturgy, in Russian tsardom, in Balkan monarchies, and in diaspora churches. But to truly understand how the fall of Byzantium stretched beyond 1453, we must follow its fragments into the modern world, into how it influenced ideology, conflict, and even the sense of history itself. Let us turn for a moment to the 20th century, an age of unprecedented transformation. The world wars, the Cold War, and the rise of secular ideologies fractured much of the traditional social and religious order in Europe. Yet even as secularism spread, even as globalization tried to homogenize cultural memory, Byzantium became an anchor for identity in certain circles, particularly in places where religion and nationalism overlapped. In Greece, this took a complex shape. After independence in the 19th century and the disasters of the early 20th century, particularly the defeat in the Greco-Turkish War and the 1923 population exchange, the Greek state became intensely self-reflective. It looked backward to define its future. It reached toward both ancient Hellas and medieval Byzantium to construct a narrative of survival, purity, and destiny. This dual identity was not always harmonious. Classical Greece was seen as the cradle of democracy and philosophy, a favorite of Western Europe and the Enlightenment. Byzantium, in contrast, was often portrayed by Western historians as an empire of decline, corrupt, mystical, overly theological, and stagnant. Yet to many Greeks, Byzantium was the real Greece, the continuation of Hellenism through Christendom, a millennium of sovereignty and spiritual authority that shaped the Greek soul far more deeply than marble statues and city-states ever had. This tension permeated Greek education, politics, and church-state relations. The Greek Orthodox Church remained one of the most respected institutions in the country, and its rhetoric often drew directly from Byzantine precedent. The memory of Constantinople's fall became a national wound, commemorated in public ceremonies and mourned in liturgy. May 29th, the day the city fell, became a symbolic day of mourning and prayer. One of the most powerful cultural phenomena in Greece was the persistence of the megali idea, the great idea, which we discussed earlier. Even after its political collapse in the 1920s, it lived on in the cultural subconscious. Constantinople remained, for many, not Istanbul but the city, Ipoli. Songs, poems, and folk tales whispered of its lost glory and foretold its future liberation. The Byzantine flag, the golden double-headed eagle, continued to fly outside many churches, fluttering beside the modern Greek flag, a quiet assertion of what once was. But even as the Greek world clung to its Byzantine roots, modernity posed challenges. During the military junta of 1967-1974, the regime tried to bind itself to traditional Greek and Orthodox ideals. They presented themselves as defenders of Hellenic Christian heritage, citing both ancient and Byzantine glories. Icons appeared on propaganda posters. Byzantine-style military parades evoked imperial triumphs. The church hierarchy was co-opted. Yet this blending of political power and religious tradition exposed deep contradictions. When the regime fell, it left behind a society more skeptical of the manipulation of religious heritage, but not one ready to abandon it. In parallel, the global Greek diaspora carried this memory abroad. In Australia, the United States, Canada, and Western Europe, Greek Orthodox cathedrals were often modeled after Byzantine architecture: domes, mosaics, gold-leafed icons. The liturgies were conducted in the ancient style. Greek schools taught both classical and Byzantine history, and local communities celebrated the feast days of saints who had lived and died under imperial rule. But Byzantium's reach wasn't just religious or cultural, it was intellectual. In the West, Byzantine studies began to emerge as a serious academic discipline in the mid-20th century. Scholars like Stephen Runciman, George Ostrogorsky, and later Judith Herrin and Avril Cameron challenged old stereotypes that had reduced Byzantium to a decadent relic. They emphasized its creativity, its resilience, its complexity. Byzantium, they argued, was not a failed copy of Rome, nor a medieval anachronism. It was its own civilization. A civilization that fused Roman governance, Greek culture, and Christian theology into a singular vision of order and eternity. A civilization that preserved classical knowledge through the chaos of the early Middle Ages, that produced art of sublime beauty, that confronted Islam, the Crusades, and the Mongols, and endured for over 1,000 years. This academic reappraisal began to influence popular culture as well. While still relatively niche, Byzantium found its way into novels, video games, films, and documentaries. Though often romanticized or misrepresented, it gained a new mystique as a lost empire of secrets, saints, and shadowy grandeur. Yet the most powerful testament to Byzantium's afterlife lies not in fiction or fantasy, but in ritual. Every year on Pascha, Orthodox Easter, millions of Christians hear the same hymn chanted that echoed through Hagia Sophia 1,000 years ago. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death. The candles, the icons, the incense, the language, these are not reenactments. They are living traditions, and they are deeply, irrevocably Byzantine. Even in newly independent Orthodox churches, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the Byzantine model persists. The liturgical books are translations of Byzantine texts. The ecclesiastical calendar follows the rhythm of the imperial church. The vestments, the architecture, the very idea of hierarchy and apostolic succession all bear the marks of Byzantium. But perhaps the most paradoxical aspect of the Byzantine afterlife is its appeal beyond orthodoxy. In recent years, even some Catholic and Protestant scholars and believers have begun to rediscover Byzantium, not as a foil to the West, but as a lost sibling. The rise of interest in patristics, early Christian mysticism, and liturgical theology has brought many Western Christians into contact with the world of the Eastern Fathers. Basil the Great, Gregory of Nazianzus, John Chrysostom, whose works define the Byzantine spiritual imagination. Some liturgical reform movements have looked to Byzantium as a model for recovering sacredness in worship. Some intellectuals, disillusioned with secular modernity, have found in the Byzantine synthesis of faith and reason a compelling alternative. and some artists have drawn inspiration from Byzantine iconography, seeing in its stylized beauty a way of representing the sacred in a postmodern world. And so Byzantium, long dismissed by Enlightenment thinkers as a tomb of superstition, is being quietly rediscovered as a treasury of wisdom, as a world of complexity, as a civilization of paradox. But let us not idealize. Byzantium was also an empire of cruelty. It practiced torture as spectacle. It waged wars of extermination. It justified religious intolerance. It clung to hierarchy with ferocious intensity. It silenced dissent. It fell, in part, because of its own rigidity and its internal betrayals. The church became an instrument of state control. The nobility hoarded power. The people suffered through endless wars, famines, and taxes. The theological disputes that divided the empire were often tools of faction and vanity, and in its final centuries, Byzantium had become insular, paranoid, and unable to adapt. These truths are part of the legacy too. The fall of Byzantium is a tragedy, but it is not a tragedy of innocence destroyed. It is a tragedy of greatness collapsing under its own weight, of a world trying to preserve eternity in a universe of change, of an empire that claimed to reflect the kingdom of heaven and found itself swallowed by history. And yet, in a strange way, its failure became its success, because what survived was not its armies or palaces, but its spirit, a spirit that taught 1,000 generations to see the world as sacred. That shaped the theology of half of Christendom. That gave language to faith, structure to liturgy, form to beauty. That reminded the world again and again that history is not just conquest and commerce, but belief. We speak of the fall of the Byzantine Empire, but what truly fell? A city, yes. A dynasty, a state, a flag, but not the idea, not the vision, that lives on in churches, in hearts, in memory. To understand the breadth of Byzantium's legacy in the post-1453 world, we must expand our lens even further, to examine how the idea of Byzantium has become entangled in global narratives, appropriated by ideologies, and transformed by cultural memory. We must also consider how its fall continues to haunt political philosophy, religious movements, and the very framework through which we interpret history. First, let's address a powerful but subtle truth. Byzantium was not just a state, it was a worldview. The empire functioned as a civilizational model, one that fused religion and governance, metaphysics and law, liturgy and citizenship. Its political theology was not a relic of primitive absolutism, as Enlightenment critics claimed, but a cohesive, sophisticated articulation of cosmic order. For Byzantines, the emperor was not merely a ruler, he was a living icon of divine justice. The city was not just an urban center, it was the microcosm of a redeemed world. The church was not merely a spiritual refuge, it was the heart of the empire's ontological identity. This framework did not vanish in 1453. It splintered, yes, but pieces of it were reabsorbed into other systems. The dream of sacred kingship persisted. The notion of symphony between priesthood and empire reappeared in Tsarist Russia, in Orthodox monarchies, even in some Western Catholic political theory. Though the West moved increasingly towards secular models of government after the Reformation and the Enlightenment, the Eastern Christian world often maintained the Byzantine ideal, that faith must remain the soul of the nation. This idea, however, has also been misused. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as nationalism rose across Europe and the Middle East, many states reached into the past for legitimacy. For Orthodox nations, Byzantium offered a ready-made image of divine ancestry. But in some cases, this led to dangerous distortions. Russian imperial ideology, especially under Nicholas I, and later under the ideology of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, used the Byzantine model to justify centralization, suppression of dissent, and the sacredness of Russian identity. The Third Rome theory, once a theological vision of spiritual succession, hardened into a justification for imperial expansion and moral superiority. Serbian nationalists drew heavily on the medieval Serbian Empire, which had been a client and imitator of Byzantium. The 14th century coronation of Stefan Dusan as Emperor of the Serbs and Romans was recalled in nationalist propaganda. His empire, which briefly rivaled Constantinople, became a symbol of Serbia's imagined destiny. This became especially pronounced in the late 20th century, as religious and national identities were wielded as weapons during the Balkan conflicts. In Greece, the Byzantine legacy was often deployed in debates about identity between secular Europeanism and Orthodox traditionalism. In the cultural memory of many Greeks, Byzantium was not merely a historical phase, it was who they were. Even the architecture of Athens reflects this tension. Neoclassical government buildings inspired by ancient Hellas and Byzantine domes crowning churches only streets away. But Byzantium's afterlife did not remain confined to Orthodox nations. In Western Europe and North America, the Byzantine Empire once carried a reputation for decadence and decline, a view shaped largely by Renaissance polemics, Enlightenment critiques, and Protestant suspicion of Eastern mysticism. Edward Gibbon's infamous lines in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire dismissed the Byzantines as superstitious, effeminate, and obsessed with dogma. For generations, Western readers viewed Byzantium as a cautionary tale, a civilization paralyzed by bureaucracy, choked by religious intolerance, and drained by endless theological argument. This image, however, began to change in the late 20th century. As postmodern thought began to question the triumphalism of Western historical narratives, Byzantium found new defenders. Scholars began to explore the empire not as a failed copy of Rome, but as a distinct civilization. They examined its legal structures, its diplomacy, its art, its city planning, and its contributions to science, medicine, and education. Historians began to ask different questions. How did Byzantium survive for over 1,000 years when so many empires collapsed in decades? How did it negotiate the pressures of Islam, Latin Christendom, nomadic invasions, and internal strife? How did it preserve classical knowledge during centuries of instability? How did its theology and culture shape the worldview of half the Christian world? And slowly, a different image emerged. Not of decline, but of resilience, not of decadence, but of sophistication, not of rigidity, but of continuity. This re-evaluation has led to new interest in Byzantium's philosophy, especially among theologians and scholars seeking to bridge ancient and modern worlds. The works of the Cappadocian Fathers, the mysticism of Gregory Palamas, the icon theology of John of Damascus, these have become subjects of serious study, even in Western seminaries and universities. Meanwhile, in the digital age, Byzantium has entered the public imagination in unexpected ways. Online forums, social media, and video platforms are filled with enthusiasts of Byzantine history. Documentaries, podcasts, and fan-created content explore the battles, the emperors, the intrigues, and the theological controversies of the empire. Video games such as the Total War and Crusader Kings series include Byzantine factions, often portraying the complex diplomatic and religious networks that characterize the empire. In meme culture, the Byzantines have become oddly popular. The phrase Deus Vult, though technically from Latin Crusaders, is often humorously linked with Byzantine-style orthodoxy. Stylized versions of the double-headed eagle, imperial regalia, and Greek slogans circulate in online art and satire. Though sometimes trivializing, these depictions reveal a deep fascination with the empire's mystique, a mixture of reverence and playful reinterpretation. Byzantium, for better or worse, has become a symbol. For some, it is a symbol of spiritual depth, of a civilization that valued the eternal over the immediate. For others, it is a symbol of lost greatness, a mourned world of order and transcendence. For still others, it is a warning, a mirror of how even a vast and intelligent empire can fall when it cannot reform. And yet, despite the varied meanings imposed upon it, Byzantium's influence is undeniable. Its architectural forms continue to inspire cathedrals, government buildings, and cultural centers. Its concept of sacred space, domes representing the heavens, mosaics of saints watching from gold backgrounds, remains embedded in Orthodox spirituality. Its language continues in liturgy. Its chants echo through monasteries and churches. Its symbols, like the labarum or the Cairo or the imperial eagle, are tattooed, painted, and venerated across continents. And in cities like Thessaloniki, Bucharest, Sofia, Moscow, Jerusalem, and even in parts of Rome, the remnants of Byzantium still stand, half ruined, half glorious. They are not ruins in the Roman sense. They are not entirely of the past. They are still used, prayed in, lived around. The fall of Byzantium, then, is not a historical point. It is a continuum. It is a series of crises, losses, adaptations, and revivals that stretch from the 15th century to the present moment. It fell in 1453, but it also fell again in 1461 with the fall of Trebizond. It fell again in 1821 with the execution of the Patriarch during the Greek War of Independence. It fell in 1922 with the final expulsion of Greeks from Asia Minor. It fell in 2020 when Hagia Sophia was turned back into a mosque. But each fall has been met with memory, ritual, and defiance. And perhaps that is Byzantium's greatest legacy. Not in how it ruled, but in how it was remembered. Not in its victory, but in its endurance. Not in its certainty, but in its complexity. And so, as we consider the world we live in now, with its fractures between East and West, its struggles over the role of religion in public life, its rediscovery of sacred tradition, we are walking the edges of Byzantium's long shadow. We live in a world still shaped by the questions the Byzantines asked. What is the relationship between faith and power? What makes a state legitimate? What is the role of beauty in public life? Can the sacred and the political coexist, or must one destroy the other? In every debate over nationalism and universalism, over liturgy and innovation, over unity and schism, the Byzantine voice is still present, quiet, layered, contradictory. A civilization that would not die. As we push further into the modern age, the spectre of Byzantium does not fade, it evolves. It moves not only through religion and culture, but into geopolitics, architecture, philosophy, and even the imagination of those yearning for lost unity in a fractured world. Byzantium's fall might be 6 centuries behind us, but its reverberations continue to reshape the ideological battlegrounds of today. And what was once dismissed as the fading twilight of a dying empire now flickers as a source of renewal for those seeking continuity in a world defined by rupture. We begin with the most visible survival of Byzantium, the Orthodox Christian liturgical tradition. Despite centuries of invasion, suppression, diaspora, and modernization, the core of Byzantine worship remains largely intact. In a time when many religions have adapted themselves to meet secular tastes, orthodoxy, for the most part, has resisted the dilution of its forms. Step into an Orthodox church today, be it in rural Romania or inner-city Brooklyn, and the experience is unmistakably Byzantine. The incense, the vestments, the icons, the rhythmic rise and fall of ancient chant, the very architecture, domes, apses, and iconostases, tells a story of continuity that defies rupture. And these liturgical forms are not just aesthetic, they encode a worldview. They express a cosmology where heaven and earth interlock through ritual, where history is not linear but cyclical, an eternal return of feasts, fasts, and divine mysteries, where beauty is not ornamental but ontological. The space, the chant, the icon, they do not point to the sacred. They are the sacred, invisible form. This is pure Byzantium, and it offers something rare in the modern world, transcendence through order, a vision of the world not as chaos to be tamed, but as a divine architecture to be inhabited. That this experience still exists and is still central to the identity of hundreds of millions is a testament to the empire's survival beyond its political death. But this liturgical continuity is only part of the story. We must now look at the political philosophy embedded in Byzantium. The idea of the imperium as a mirror of divine authority, the emperor as both ruler and servant of God, the state as guardian of orthodoxy. Though today such ideals may sound alien or even threatening to the secular mind, they still echo in subtle and not so subtle ways in certain corners of the modern world. Nowhere is this more evident than in Russia. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation has undergone a re-Byzantinization of its national mythology. The Kremlin is no longer merely a political structure. It is a theater of sacred symbology. The close alliance between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian state mimics, consciously or not, the Byzantine ideal of symphonia. Orthodox patriarchs bless warships and space missions. The image of the Tsar martyr Nicholas Roman II is venerated, not just religiously but politically, as a bridge between past and present, sacred and civic. Putin's regime has often invoked the language of Christian civilization, cultural continuity, and spiritual warfare, all deeply Byzantine concepts filtered through the lens of modern nationalism. His appeals to the Russian people as the defenders of Christian tradition against Western decadence are not invented from whole cloth. They draw from centuries-old narratives forged in the twilight years of Byzantium and carried north through exile and dynastic marriage. And yet this too is a mutation of Byzantium, not its replication. The Russian adaptation is selective, nationalized, and often militarized. Where the Byzantine emperor ruled a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire with careful diplomacy and theological precision, modern Byzantine revivals often ignore that pluralism. The universalism of the old oikoumene, the idea that the empire was a sacred canopy under which many peoples and rites coexisted, is replaced by narrower visions of ethnic destiny and religious exclusivity. Still, the yearning for Byzantine grandeur persists across borders. In the Balkans, the Orthodox revival that followed the collapse of communism saw a rebirth of Byzantine art, architecture, and education. New churches were built in the cross and square style. Seminaries reintroduced Byzantine chant and patristic theology. Pilgrimages to Mount Athos increased. Even in war-torn regions, the image of Byzantium offered a kind of lost wholeness, a vision of harmony between heaven and earth that stood in contrast to the modern condition. And in the West, especially in parts of the Catholic Church seeking to reclaim ancient traditions, the Byzantine legacy has gained fresh attention. Some Latin Rite Catholics now incorporate Byzantine icons into their private devotions. Monasteries study the Eastern Fathers. The ecumenical movement, which seeks to bridge divisions between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, often appeals to the shared history of the first millennium, a history in which Byzantium played the central role. This rediscovery, however, is also marked by contradiction. The West often struggles to fully understand Byzantium. Its worldview, sacramental, hierarchical, mystical, is hard to reconcile with post-Enlightenment liberalism. Its emphasis on liturgical rhythm over spontaneous prayer, on icons over innovation, on collective salvation over individual experience, jars with modern spiritual instincts. And yet, precisely because it is so different, it draws the curious. Among intellectuals disillusioned with modernity, be they philosophers, theologians, or artists, Byzantium offers a countermodel to the rationalist, materialist project of the West. Its theology of beauty, its political mysticism, its sense of the sacred. These are seen not as relics, but as prophetic. We now must consider perhaps the strangest and most recent incarnation of Byzantine afterlife, its place in the Internet age. The digital world has given rise to something resembling a Neo-Byzantine subculture, an odd fusion of historical interest, aesthetic admiration, and theological exploration. Byzantine memes, Orthodox YouTube channels, virtual monasteries, online courses in medieval Greek and patristic theology, Instagram pages filled with mosaics, saints, and scripture. Much of this is playful, some is deeply reverent, but all of it signals a hunger for mystery, for rootedness, for transcendence. In an age of fluid identities and ephemeral trends, Byzantium represents something unchanging, something that endured. The fall of Constantinople was once the end of a world. Today, it is the beginning of an inquiry. Why did Byzantium fall? Was it inevitable? Was it divine punishment or human failure? What did it preserve? What did it fail to defend? What might it teach us now? Each generation has answered these questions differently. To medieval Latins, the fall was proof of Eastern heresy. To Renaissance Italians, it was the death of Greek wisdom, though they inherited its flame. To 18th century philosophers, it was a cautionary tale of theocracy run amok. To 19th century nationalists, it was a lost homeland. To 20th century modernists, it was a shadowy backdrop for ideological rebirth. To 21st century pilgrims, it is a still-burning lamp in the darkness. Even now, Constantinople, modern Istanbul, is a city of veils. Beneath Ottoman mosques lie Christian basilicas. Beneath Turkish streets lie Roman roads. In some neighborhoods, Greek inscriptions still linger on broken stones. Every church-turned-mosque-turned-museum-turned-mosque again carries the memory of civilizations layered atop one another, arguing silently through marble and minaret. The question of Byzantium's fall is thus not merely academic, it is existential. It forces us to ask, what does it mean for a civilization to die, and what, if anything, can survive that death? Is it the territory that defines an empire, its crown, its armies, or is it its faith, its rituals, its idea of the sacred? By those standards, Byzantium has not fallen, it has dispersed, and its shards have cut deep into history, into the very flesh of nations, churches, and hearts. It may never return as an empire of borders and banners, but it returns each time the bells ring at Pascha. Each time a scholar opens the Philokalia. Each time a child learns to cross themselves right to left. Each time a pilgrim ascends the stone steps of Mount Athos and breathes the air of centuries. In that sense, the fall of Byzantium was not the end of a civilization. It was its transfiguration. We now arrive at a critical juncture in this exploration, not just to recount, but to reflect, to see how the fall of Byzantium, once a singular cataclysm in 1453, evolved into a generational trauma, an ideological legacy, and a spiritual inheritance. To understand that the story of the Byzantine Empire did not end, it fragmented, it morphed, it lived on in forms the world often didn't recognize as its own. And that story, still unfolding, finds its latest chapters not in marble ruins or dusty chronicles, but in power struggles, pilgrimages, and the reshaping of human consciousness in a fractured age. We must now explore Byzantium not just as history, but as a worldview resisting dissolution. This worldview has never been merely political. It is ontological. It is concerned with what it means to be human, to exist in a cosmos ruled not by chance, but by divine order. For Byzantium, the state existed not to promote the will of man, but to mirror the kingdom of God. The ruler was not an elected official or a divine right monarch in the Western sense, but a steward responsible before God for the order and purity of the empire. This idea of sacred kingship has not vanished. It has simply moved. In modern Russia, it has reappeared as a mystical nationalism, centered not on a person, but on the identity of the nation itself. Russia as the last bastion of true Christianity, a continuation of the Orthodox oikoumene. In Greek Orthodoxy, the longing for the city, Constantinople, has not faded, even if modern Greece no longer pursues the megaly idea. The memory of the empire still pulses through every paschal hymn, every gold icon, every dome erected over a modern skyline. In the holy mountain of Athos, Byzantium never fell. Their 20 Orthodox monasteries, each with its own fortress walls, libraries of medieval manuscripts, and sacred relics, still operate on a Byzantine calendar. Their liturgies remain unchanged. Their Byzantine flags, yellow with the double-headed eagle, still fly in the sea wind. Time moves differently there. A visitor walks into the 21st century and finds himself in the 10th. Athos does not just preserve the past, it embodies Byzantium's inner life. It reveals the empire's true heart was never the palace but the altar, not the crown but the cross. This is why Byzantium's fall was never total. Its political power was extinguished, its military erased, its bureaucracy scattered. But its inner world, its theology, its iconography, its chant, its vision of sacred time, continued without pause. The liturgy celebrated in the ruins of Constantinople after the conquest was the same as that celebrated in exile, and the same as what is celebrated now in churches across 5 continents. What empire survives in such a way? The Roman Empire died in the West. Its Latin language faded into the roots of Romance tongues. Its pagan rites were outlawed. Its temples became museums. But Byzantium, it survives every time a candle is lit before an icon, every time the great doxology is sung, every time a convert bows before a gospel book bound in velvet and gold. But even this liturgical survival is only part of the mosaic. In modern academic discourse, Byzantium has forced a reconsideration of what we mean by civilization. Once treated as a medieval curiosity, a decadent cousin of Rome, Byzantium is now seen by many as a civilizational pivot point. It was a bridge across centuries, uniting the ancient with the medieval, the classical with the Christian, the Eastern with the Western. And as the 21st century moves deeper into crises of identity and meaning, Byzantium offers a third way, not modernity versus tradition, not reason versus mysticism, but an integration of the two. In an age of digitization and abstraction, the Byzantine idea of embodiment, the sacred image, the sanctity of the body, the mystery of incarnation, resonates with those seeking rootedness. Its emphasis on ritual, community, and transcendence challenges the fragmentation of postmodern life. Even the aesthetic of Byzantium is re-emerging. Modern artists, disillusioned with realism and skeptical of postmodern irony, are revisiting the stylized forms of iconography. Gold leaf, reverse perspective, and sacred symbolism are being rediscovered not just as religious tools, but as philosophical statements. In literature, Byzantium provides rich ground for allegory, fantasy, and alternate histories. In fashion and design, Byzantine motifs, brocades, crosses, imperial reds and purples, surface in couture collections and architecture alike. There is a hunger for what Byzantium once represented, integration, not a utopia, but a vision of order, beauty, and meaning in a cosmos charged with divinity. But we must not romanticize the past. Byzantium was not a perfect civilization. It was, in its own time, riddled with contradictions. The empire was capable of extraordinary cruelty, blinding political rivals, executing heretics, suppressing dissent with theological and military force. Its theological brilliance often devolved into factional violence. Its defense of orthodoxy sometimes became a tool of imperial paranoia. And yet, in the ruins of that contradiction, something survived that was greater than the sum of its failures. It wasn't just an empire of marble and blood. It was a worldview that insisted history had a purpose, that suffering could be sanctified. That time was not a straight line to oblivion, but a spiral returning always to resurrection. That vision continues to haunt. Even in the modern Republic of Turkey, echoes of Byzantium are unavoidable. The very city of Istanbul, with its minarets and palaces, is layered upon Byzantine foundations. The names of neighborhoods, Fena, Balat, Blaşany, carry the ghosts of emperors, patriarchs, and councils. The walls built by Theodosius still stand in places, battered but defiant. Hagia Sophia, now a mosque once more, continues to draw millions, not just Muslims, but Orthodox pilgrims, historians, seekers. It is a monument not only to conquest, but to transformation. Even when converted, covered, or repurposed, these buildings pulse with memory. They whisper not just of what was lost, but of what remains. And in this, perhaps, is the strangest truth of all. The fall of Byzantium is still not complete. Each generation inherits the fragments and decides what to do with them. Some bury them, some commercialize them, some revive them, some turn them into fantasy, some into faith. And so the empire continues, no longer in the form of a crown or a standing army, but in a network of memory, language, architecture, music, prayer, and myth. A distributed empire, an empire without borders, a civilization now scattered across time more than space. The fall of Byzantium is not a single point in history. It is a process that continues to unfold. The questions it raised remain the questions of our time. How do we live in a world between tradition and innovation, between the sacred and the secular, between East and West, between power and humility? The Byzantines never resolved these tensions. They lived them, they sanctified them, they suffered under them. And in their fall, they left a mirror for us. The mirror does not offer answers. It offers a vision, a way of seeing. And that, more than its emperors, armies, or palaces, is Byzantium's most enduring gift. At this point in our journey through the aftermath of the Byzantine Empire, we're no longer looking solely at the empire as a political construct, but as a complex set of cultural, spiritual, and psychological legacies still operating beneath the surface of modern civilization. Byzantium was never just about emperors or walls. It was about how people understood time, authority, purpose, and holiness. These categories didn't vanish in 1453. They mutated, they migrated, and in many ways, they have outlived the material foundations that once supported them. But let us now turn to one of the most poignant aspects of Byzantium's fall, the diaspora. What happened to the people? The monks, the scribes, the scholars, the artisans, the priests, the nobles who survived the conquest. The answer is a story of displacement and unexpected flourishing. In the immediate wake of the fall of Constantinople, waves of refugees fled westward. Some escaped to Venetian territories like Crete and the Ionian Islands. Others went further, across the Adriatic into Italy, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. Among these exiles were some of the finest minds of the late Byzantine world: grammarians, philosophers, calligraphers, and theologians, men who carried with them not only the trauma of a lost world, but the treasures of an old one. One of the most significant figures was Basilios Bessarion, a Byzantine scholar and churchman who converted to Catholicism during the failed attempt to unite the Eastern and Western churches at the Council of Florence in 1439. After the fall, he settled in Italy, eventually becoming a cardinal. He gathered an immense library of Greek manuscripts and used his position to preserve and disseminate the classical and Christian works of the East. His efforts laid the groundwork for what would become the Renaissance. Yes, the Renaissance was not merely a rediscovery of ancient Rome. It was a resurrection assisted by Byzantium. Many scholars credit the arrival of Greek intellectuals from Byzantium with accelerating the revival of classical learning in Italy. These men, trained in the Platonic and Aristotelian traditions as preserved through orthodox monastic schools, introduced the West to texts that had been unknown or long forgotten. They translated, taught, debated, and inspired a new generation of thinkers. And in this, Byzantium did not fall. It exploded into the bloodstream of Europe. The theological and philosophical debates that had animated Constantinople's intellectual life were transplanted to Florence, Venice, and Rome. The mystical traditions of the East, once mocked by rationalist Latin theologians, began to influence Western spirituality. Even the iconographic style of Byzantine painting, with its elongated figures and gold backgrounds, left an imprint on early Renaissance religious art. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, the diaspora took different forms. Greek-speaking merchants, monks, and administrators found refuge in Moldavia, Wallachia, and Transylvania, regions under the rule of orthodox or semi-autonomous Christian lords. In these places, Byzantine models of court ceremony, ecclesiastical structure, and artistic expression were preserved and even further developed. Churches in the Romanian principalities were built and painted in styles directly descended from late Byzantine aesthetics. Lush frescoes, theological narratives in color, and iconostases carved with almost mathematical precision. In Slavic lands, particularly Russia and Serbia, the Byzantine refugees brought not only cultural capital but spiritual weight. They were seen as survivors of the sacred city, guardians of divine tradition. Their presence validated the emerging idea that Moscow or other Slavic courts might now carry the imperial torch. Even beyond orthodoxy, Byzantine ideas continued to influence the Islamic world. The Ottomans, who had conquered Constantinople, were not merely destroyers, they were synthesizers. They adopted many Byzantine institutions, land management systems, taxation methods, administrative hierarchies. The court ceremonial of the Ottoman Sultan owed much to the Byzantine model of imperial dignity. Even the layout of the Topkapi Palace, with its nested courtyards and ritualized space, echoed the great palace of the Eastern Roman emperors. Moreover, the transformation of Hagia Sophia into a mosque did not erase its symbolic power, it merely redirected it. The Ottomans recognized its greatness. They preserved much of its structure, even its name, Hagia Sophia. The architectural elements of Byzantine churches, domes on pendentives, cascading exedri, central planning, were incorporated into Ottoman mosque design. The very skyline of Istanbul became a visual dialogue between continuity and conquest. This architectural legacy spread with Ottoman expansion. In cities like Thessaloniki, Edirne, and Sarajevo, we see buildings that reflect the blended DNA of Byzantine Christian and Ottoman Islamic aesthetics. In this sense, Byzantium did not fall, it was digested. But even within the Islamic world, some began to remember Byzantium with fascination. By the 19th century, with the rise of historical consciousness and modern nationalism, Arab and Turkish intellectuals began studying Byzantium not just as the defeated other, but as part of their own past. In Arab histories, references to the Rumis, the Romans, persisted, showing that the memory of Byzantium had not entirely vanished, even in lands where the crescent now flew. Meanwhile, in the West, as Orientalism took hold, Byzantium was often caught in the crossfire. To Western Europeans, it was neither fully East nor truly West. It was the exotic middle, a place of golden churches, eunuchs, and intrigue. This image was half myth, half caricature, but it fueled fascination. Novelists like Sir Walter Scott and later historical fantasy authors painted Byzantium as a world of decadence and mystery, often missing its theological heart, but capturing its atmospheric depth. This fascination only deepened with archaeology. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, excavations in Constantinople, Thessaloniki, and Ravenna unearthed mosaics, reliquaries, and manuscripts that redefined Western understanding of Byzantine sophistication. The shimmering image of Empress Theodora in San Vitale or the awe-inspiring Pantocrator in the Dome of Daphne became part of the Western visual imagination. Byzantium, once dismissed, was now curated. It entered museums. It became collectible. It was placed under glass, labeled, catalogued, but still alive. Even in the secularized world of post-war Europe and America, Byzantium persisted in memory. Scholars debated its fall not only as a military event, but as a philosophical collapse. What happens when a civilization is unable to adapt? Was Byzantium too rigid, too introspective, too obsessed with theology? Or was it the last defender of meaning in a disintegrating world? Some thinkers began to view Byzantium not as an object of failure, but of resistance. Resistance to chaos, to relativism, to nihilism. In the glowing icons and orderly rituals, they saw a vision of sacred order against the formless void. In recent decades, this resistance has taken new forms. We've seen a resurgence in Orthodox theology in the West. Figures like John Zizioulas, Alexander Schmemann, and Callistos were bringing Byzantine thought into contemporary dialogue. Their writings on Eucharistic theology, personhood, and liturgy have influenced not only theologians, but philosophers, ethicists, and artists. Byzantium's voice, long silenced in academic circles, now speaks again in journals, lectures, conferences, and even in spiritual movements. We also see it in public ceremonies and national identity. In modern-day Greece, state functions often begin with orthodox blessings, priests with censers invoking the Holy Spirit, Byzantine chant echoing through parliament halls. The church remains deeply entwined with public life, not as a remnant, but as a force. In Russia, national holidays are celebrated with military parades followed by cathedral services. In Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania, churches are filled on feast days that were established by emperors long dead, in a language shaped by Byzantine hymnographers. In America, new Orthodox churches are being built in towns and suburbs, sometimes with no ethnic affiliation, just people drawn to the ancient way. Converts are discovering Byzantium through liturgy, through chant, through theology, and finding in it not a dead civilization, but a living alternative. So where does all this leave us? The fall of Byzantium was not just a historical event, it was a cosmic drama. And like all cosmic dramas, it was never just about buildings or battles. It was about vision. And that vision has endured far longer than the empire itself. An empire can fall. A city can burn. A crown can roll across the marble floor. But an idea rooted in heaven, can never be killed so easily. Byzantium remains, in stone and in spirit, in gold and in gospel, in lamentation and in light. As we delve into the deeper waters of the Byzantine legacy, a final truth becomes clear. The fall of Byzantium is not a closed event. It is an active inheritance. It echoes through how people worship, how they remember, how they construct identity, and how they imagine their place in a cosmic order. The continuity is not symbolic. It is functional, often unconscious, passed through rites, aesthetics, and rhythms that make up the bones of Eastern Christian life and subtly influence others far beyond it. But beyond churches, beyond culture, beyond even memory, Byzantium remains embedded in the very question of what it means to endure. What does it mean for a civilization to survive its own annihilation? The Byzantine Empire did something few civilizations have done. It transmuted itself into tradition. After 1453, no empire rose with its name, no borders were drawn anew. But the faith, the form, the vision, those survived, became portable, and outlived states. This was Byzantium's final act of genius, to make itself into a vessel that could survive on the sea of history, without a fleet, without walls. We return again to Hagia Sophia, not merely as a monument, but as metaphor. Built in the 6th century under Justinian I, it was hailed not as architecture, but as revelation. "Solomon, I have outdone thee," the emperor reportedly said. For nearly 1,000 years, it was the heart of Orthodox Christianity, the palace of the Logos. When the Ottomans took the city, they converted it into a mosque, respecting its structure while Islamizing its purpose. In the 20th century, the Turkish Republic turned it into a museum, secularizing it, freezing it in time. And in 2020, it was reconverted into a mosque, triggering global reflection on what this act meant. But Hagia Sophia itself remains. Its stones remain. Its dome still catches the morning light. Beneath layers of plaster and paint, its icons still gaze out. Some have re-emerged, others sleep. That is Byzantium, still breathing beneath the surface, waiting. Across the Orthodox world, similar stories play out, churches rebuilt, hymns resung, emperors remembered in liturgy. Each year on the Sunday of Orthodoxy, icons are lifted high once more, triumphing over iconoclasm, over forgetfulness, over death. And we must now speak of this liturgical memory. The Byzantine Church did not just preserve scripture or sacraments, it preserved a way of living time. The calendar of feasts, fasts, saints, and seasons creates a rhythm that shapes not only belief but perception. The Byzantine cycle of time is not linear, it is ascending. Each year replays salvation history, with new meaning revealed each time. Holy Week, for example, is not mere recollection. It is participation. The faithful do not watch the Passion, they enter it. This structure teaches resilience. A people who live in sacred time cannot be easily erased. Even when empires fall, time continues. Byzantium trained its people to endure, not by political strength, but by liturgical imagination. And it is that imagination that keeps the empire alive. Children in Athens learn the Troparia of Easter before they can read. Converts in Detroit or Sydney study the Church Fathers with a reverence born not of history, but of spiritual hunger. Serbian monks translate Greek manuscripts by candlelight. Ethiopian clergy chant Byzantine hymns in jazz. Converts build icon corners in apartments and learn the theology of light, color, and gesture. This is Byzantium not as memory, but as energy, and that energy continues to animate even secular debates. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, part of the ideological backdrop was a war over history, over inheritance. The Russian Orthodox Church claimed spiritual and historical authority over Ukraine, invoking its role as the guardian of Holy Ruse and heir to Constantinople. The ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople disagreed, granting autocephaly to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and in so doing reviving the old imperial tensions. The schism that followed was not simply religious, it was Byzantine, a struggle over who speaks for the empire now, over whose Rome is legitimate, over what it means to be orthodox in a world no longer united by empire but still haunted by its loss. This contest will continue. It may never be resolved, but it shows us that Byzantium is not simply a lost civilization. It is an unresolved proposition. A question whispered through centuries: can the sacred and the political be reconciled? In Byzantium, they were married. In the modern world, they are often at war. But the Byzantine idea still tempts us, still dares us to imagine a world ordered not just by power or money, but by holiness. And perhaps this is why Byzantium haunts even those outside its religious orbit, because it represents a unity we no longer believe possible. A civilization with one faith, one vision, one rhythm. A cosmos where the emperor served the altar and the altar consecrated the city. Where art was theology, where law was iconography, where the visible world shimmered with signs. We live in a disenchanted world, but Byzantium never disenchanted anything. It sanctified everything, even its politics, even its failures. That vision will always remain both alluring and dangerous. Alluring because it offers wholeness, dangerous because it tempts power to claim divinity. In the end, we cannot go back. Byzantium, in its original form, will not return. The city is no longer imperial. The empire is dust. But what Byzantium saw, what it carried across centuries, is not gone. It is in our questions, in our prayers, in the way a dome draws the eye upward, in the way a chant stills the soul, in the flame that flickers in icon lamps across the world. And so we end not with a death, but with a paradox. The fall of the Byzantine Empire was the death of a political order. It was also the birth of a civilizational memory, an echo that refuses silence, a hymn still being sung. We have walked a long road through the ruins of an empire that refused to die, and as we draw closer to completing this documentary narrative, what remains is not just summation, but illumination. Byzantium was never merely a kingdom of kings. It was a kingdom of memory, and in many ways, its post-1453 story tells us more about the human need for sacred continuity than about lost battles and broken thrones. Now let us examine how Byzantium, even in its absence, shapes the world's conversation about legacy, empire, and meaning. We must begin with the very notion of empire itself. The Byzantine idea of empire was fundamentally different from the empires that followed. It was not colonial in the modern sense. Byzantium did not imagine its authority as grounded in the exploitation of distant peoples or the expansion of markets. It saw itself, rather, as a steward of divine order, tasked with preserving right worship, right belief, and the harmony between heaven and earth. This imperial ideal has been both mocked and imitated. In Western Europe, after the fall of Constantinople, a vacuum opened. The papacy, the Holy Roman Empire, and later European colonial powers tried, each in their own way, to claim the title of successor to Rome. But no one ever quite reclaimed Byzantium's synthesis of spiritual and political authority. It was too total, too alien, too burdened with metaphysical gravity. And yet, the shadow of Byzantine structure, its legal codes, its diplomatic protocols, its vision of Christian universality, lingered. Even in the Enlightenment era, when reason and secularism tried to erase medieval legacy, the Byzantine model persisted in legal, ecclesiastical, and even architectural systems. Gothic cathedrals pointed to heaven. Legal codes traced their ancestry to Justinian. University faculties bore the imprint of orthodox theological pedagogy. And all the while, in hidden monasteries and village churches, Byzantium lived on in its most invincible form, liturgy. One cannot overstate this. While other empires fell with the sacking of their capitals or the signing of treaties, Byzantium, through the Orthodox Church, ensured that every Sunday, in thousands of chapels around the world, its worldview would be proclaimed again. Blessed is the kingdom of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. That phrase begins the divine liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, written in the 4th century, refined in the 9th, still sung today. It is not a metaphor. It is the survival of the empire in word and breath. Let us now consider the double-headed eagle, perhaps the most iconic symbol of Byzantium. It looks both east and west. Originally a sign of the unity between the emperor's earthly and spiritual duties, it came to represent the universal claim of the Roman Empire: 2 realms, 1 head. After 1453, the symbol migrated. It became the emblem of the Russian Tsars. It appeared on the flags of the Serbian Empire. It was resurrected by the Habsburgs. Even in modern national symbols it lurks. But the eagle is not just a relic. It is an unresolved question, a claim. Who, if anyone, has the right to speak for the Roman legacy, for orthodoxy, for that ancient city where throne and altar were once one? The answer remains elusive, because the truth is, no one inherited Byzantium, not fully. Russia took its crown, but not its cosmopolitanism. The West took its law, but not its mysticism. Greece took its language, but not its imperial scope. The Church took its rights, but not its empire. Byzantium divided itself as it fell, planting fragments in each who sought to claim it. No one got it all. Which means, paradoxically, that everyone who remembers it participates in its ghost. We must now turn to the idea of the city, Constantinople, Ipolis. To Greeks, even after its loss, Constantinople remained not just a city, but the city. The definite article mattered. It wasn't a location. It was a destination of the soul, a vision of what once was and what might be again. Even in modern Greek poetry and song, Constantinople is mourned as a homeland lost not to geography, but to history itself. The Marble King, Emperor Constantine Roman XI, who died defending the walls in 1453, became a mythic figure. Some legends said he never died, that angels turned him to marble and hid him beneath the Golden Gate, where he waits until the empire rises again. This is not mere nostalgia. It is a theology of history. Byzantium taught its people that the visible world is only one layer of reality, that beyond the broken stones and ruined walls there is a divine plan unfolding. The empire may have fallen, but the kingdom has not. In that sense, The fall of Constantinople became a mirror of the crucifixion, a moment of apparent defeat that opens into resurrection. This is why, in Orthodox liturgy, death is never the final word. Neither is 1453, and this brings us to the final, unanswerable mystery of Byzantium's fall. Why does it still matter? Why, in a secular age, amid technological transformation and global politics, does the story of a medieval empire, steeped in incense and imperial robes, still draw hearts and minds? Because Byzantium offers a rare thing: continuity. It offers a world where time is ordered, where beauty reveals truth, where the state bows before the altar, where wisdom and worship are not enemies but friends. We know such a world is fragile, perhaps impossible, perhaps even dangerous, but we long for it anyway. We long for a civilization that does not forget what is holy. That, above all, is Byzantium's enduring defiance. It refused to secularize. It refused to surrender beauty. It refused to live by bread alone. And even in its collapse, it sanctified the world, through chant, through architecture, through the quiet, stubborn survival of a people who carried the empire not in flags, but in flame. That flame still burns. The fall of the Byzantine Empire is not a singular wound in the fabric of history. It is a persistent ache, a dissonance between what was and what remains, between the crown that slipped into dust and the hymn that never ceased. As we conclude this journey, we do not reach an end point, but rather a kind of understanding. That Byzantium's fall is an open-ended legacy, a civilizational echo that moves silently beneath the feet of modernity. It is found in the sacred silence before the Eucharist, in the gilded light of a candle-lit apse, in the weeping of monks who chant matins as if no centuries have passed. But it is also found in unexpected places, in national disputes over church independence, in international debates over heritage sites and sacred spaces, in the political use of orthodoxy by post-imperial states, in the revival of ancient chant by composers who never stepped foot inside a monastery, in the tattoo of a double-headed eagle on the shoulder of a believer who has never seen the Bosphorus. Let us speak, for a moment, of Mount Athos again. That narrow peninsula jutting into the Aegean, where 20 Orthodox monasteries stand as islands of another time. Athos has existed for over a millennium, uninterrupted. When the empire fell, Athos remained. When the Ottomans ruled, Athos was respected. When the modern Greek state formed, Athos was left autonomous. When the world warred and divided and reinvented itself, Athos kept to its ancient hours. And there, Byzantium lives without metaphor. It is in the hour-long chants of the Psalter, in the fasting that mirrors the early saints, in the scriptoria where monks still copy liturgical books by hand, in the icons painted slowly, layer by sacred layer, with prayer, with silence, with reverence, and in the hearts of pilgrims, many secular, many seeking, all touched by something they often cannot name. Byzantium touches not only the religious, but the restless. It offers a vision of order in a disordered age, of beauty that is not for sale, of time that does not rush. And perhaps most subversively, it offers the idea that nothing truly holy can ever be destroyed, even when cities fall, even when empires burn, even when the walls collapse and the relics are stolen and the throne is empty. What was sanctified remains sanctified. What was true remains true. This idea is not rational. It is mystical. It is not political. It is eschatological. And that, in the end, is why Byzantium persists. Because it dared to treat history not as progress, but as liturgy. It dared to believe that the veil between heaven and earth could be pulled back, not only in cathedrals, but in cities, in courts, in households. It dared to construct a civilization on that belief. And even when the world said no, even when the cannons roared and the walls crumbled and the emperor fell, Byzantium did not renounce that vision. It simply carried it inward, into monasteries, into manuscripts, into ritual, into exile, into memory, and from there it waited. It waits still, Perhaps that is what the fall of Byzantium truly is, not a loss, but a retreat, not a collapse, but a concealment, a chrysalis. Its resurrection is not political, not imperial. Its resurrection is found in every heart that turns to the east and sings. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death. A hymn first sung when emperors still ruled, and the dome of Hagia Sophia shook with glory. A hymn still sung today. A hymn that knows no empire but the kingdom of God. And so ends this documentary, not with a final word, but with a candle still burning, a dome still standing, and a people still chanting, still remembering, still waiting for the light to return from the east. For the empire never truly died. It changed form, it became chant, it became icon, it became prayer, it became us.